The Keltharian Empire had ruled the stars for over 5,000 years, and their sleek vessels moved through space with engines that bent reality itself. Commander Vexaron stood in the massive engineering bay of the Imperial Research Station, and his 4 arms were folded in frustration. Before him floated a holographic display showing the same error pattern that had troubled their greatest minds for generations. The quantum fold drive was meant to reduce travel time between galaxies by half, but it refused to work beyond 3 parsecs. Another failure happened right in front of his compound eyes, and he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on his chitinous shoulders. Chief Engineer Dralmek approached him, and her crystalline skin dimmed with disappointment. She had spent the last 40 years of her life working on this single problem, and the answer still escaped her. The harmonic resonance collapsed at the same threshold every single time, and no amount of calculations or adjustments seemed to help. Thousands of Keltharian scientists had attempted to solve this puzzle over the centuries. They had built computational matrices the size of moons, and consulted ancient texts from civilizations that no longer existed. Some had even experimented with forbidden temporal mechanics that could have torn holes in space-time itself. Nothing worked, and nothing even came close to working. The problem appeared deceptively simple on the surface. Their new drive system generated a quantum field that required perfect symmetry across 17 dimensions. At exactly 3.2 parsecs, the system would experience a cascade failure. The field would collapse and potentially tear the ship apart in the process. Every mathematical model they created and every simulation they ran ended the same way. The ship would travel smoothly for 3.2 parsecs, and then the quantum field would destabilize in a fraction of a second. The energy release from such a collapse could destroy everything within a light year. Vexaron walked around the hologram and studied the patterns for the 10,000th time in his career. He had been assigned to this project 60 years ago, when he was a young officer fresh from the Imperial Academy. Back then, he believed the solution was just around the corner, and that his generation would be the one to crack the code. Now, his exoskeleton had turned gray with age, and he was no closer to the answer than the engineers who had worked on this 3,000 years before his birth. Dralmek manipulated the controls and brought up a new simulation. This one incorporated a theoretical adjustment to the quantum stabilizers that a research team on the outer colonies had proposed. The hologram flickered and began running the test sequence. The virtual ship activated its quantum fold drive, and space bent around it in a beautiful display of colors that human eyes could never perceive. The ship accelerated and crossed 1 parsec without issue. Then 2 parsecs and the field remained stable. Then 3 parsecs, and still, everything looked perfect. At 3.2 parsecs, the field shimmered and collapsed exactly as it had in every other test for the past 5,000 years. Perhaps we should accept our limitations, and Dralmek suggested quietly. The current drives serve us well enough, and we can cross the galaxy in reasonable time. Vexaron turned to face her, and his mandibles clicked in agitation. The High Council will not accept that answer, and he replied, in a tone that carried his frustration. They have invested 200 billion credits into this project, and they want results, not excuses. The Keltharian Empire had built its reputation on technological superiority, and the idea that they could not solve this problem was unacceptable to the ruling class. The engineering bay around them was a testament to their determination. It stretched the size of 3 human football fields and contained equipment that represented the pinnacle of Keltharian science. Quantum computers hummed in the background and processed trillions of calculations per second. Matter fabricators stood ready to create any component they might need with atomic precision. Energy collectors drew power directly from the station's fusion core and could provide enough electricity to power a small planet. Yet for all their advanced technology and all their brilliant minds, they were stuck on this one problem. Vexaron dismissed Dralmek and told her to take rest. She had been working for 30 hours straight, and exhaustion was affecting her clarity. As she left the engineering bay, he remained behind and stared at the hologram. He thought about all the engineers who had stood in this exact spot over the millennia. They had all believed they would be the one to solve it. They had all failed, and now they were dust, while the problem remained. What neither Vexaron nor Dralmec knew was that across the galaxy on a small blue planet recently admitted to the galactic community help was about to arrive from the most unexpected source. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and the species that lived there called themselves humans. They were a young race who had only achieved faster-than-light travel 20 years ago. By galactic standards, they were children playing with technology they barely understood. Their mathematics was primitive compared to Keltharian calculations, and their engineering was crude and inefficient. But humans had something that the Keltharians had lost over their thousands of years of civilization. They had fresh eyes and minds, not locked into established patterns of thinking. They approached problems with practical intuition rather than purely mathematical theory. They trusted their instincts and made leaps of logic that seemed absurd to more advanced races, and sometimes those absurd leaps led to solutions that rigorous logic could never find. The galactic community had accepted Earth into their ranks more out of curiosity than respect. Humans were interesting and entertaining in their naive enthusiasm. They asked questions that seemed obvious to older races, and made observations that everyone else had stopped noticing millennia ago. Most species viewed them as amusing pets who would eventually mature into proper galactic citizens. No one expected them to contribute anything meaningful to galactic science or culture for at least another 1,000 years. Vexaron stood alone in the engineering bay and felt the weight of failure settling over him like a heavy cloak. Tomorrow he would present another progress report to the High Council, and once again he would have to admit that they had made no advancement. The counselors would express their disappointment in the carefully neutral language of Keltharian politics. They would remind him of the resources invested and the expectations placed upon this project, and he would return to the engineering bay to stare at the same hologram and the same unsolvable problem. In 3 days, a human named Jake Hoffman would arrive at the station, and everything would change. Jake Hoffman had been working as a mechanic in Detroit for 15 years when the aliens made first contact with Earth. While the rest of humanity marveled at starships and energy weapons, Jake had been more interested in how their engines actually worked. He had always been good with machines, and if something had moving parts, Jake could fix it. Cars and planes and industrial equipment all made sense to him in a way that books and classrooms never did. His hands understood what his mind sometimes struggled to grasp through formal education. When the galactic community opened its doors to human exchange programs, Jake applied on a whim. He never expected to be accepted because he had dropped out of college after 1 semester. The math classes had bored him, and the theory seemed disconnected from actual work. But his aptitude tests showed an unusual ability for spatial reasoning and mechanical intuition. The Keltharian Empire specifically requested him after reviewing his scores and his work history. They needed someone who could look at their engineering problems with completely fresh eyes. Now, 6 months later, Jake found himself stepping off a transport shuttle onto the Imperial Research Station. He wore an ill-fitting environmental suit that kept bunching at the knees and carried a duffel bag with his personal tools. The station was massive, and it rotated slowly to generate artificial gravity through centrifugal force. Through the viewport windows, he could see stars that Earth astronomers had not even catalogued yet. The thought made him feel very small and very far from home. "You must be the human," and a translator device announced as Commander Vexaron approached. The alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and gray, chitinous skin. His compound eyes seemed to analyze Jake from every angle at once, and Jake felt like a specimen under a microscope. The commander's presence radiated authority and barely concealed skepticism. Jake extended his hand in the human greeting gesture, and after an awkward moment, Vexaron touched one of his clawed hands to Jake's palm. The skin felt cool and smooth, like polished stone. "You come highly recommended by the Terran embassy," and Vexaron said, though his tone suggested he questioned the wisdom of this decision. "I must admit, I have doubts about bringing a human to solve a problem that has defeated our best minds for 3,000 years. Our greatest scientists have spent their entire lives working on this challenge." Jake shrugged and tried not to feel intimidated by the alien's size and obvious intelligence. "Well, sometimes a fresh perspective helps," and he replied, "Back home, I once fixed a factory robot that 6 different engineers could not figure out. They were all so focused on the computer system that they did not notice the hydraulic line had a tiny crack. Vexaron's translator made a sound that might have been a sigh. This is somewhat more complex than a hydraulic line, but come, and I will show you our predicament. They walked through the station's corridors, and Jake could not help but stare at the other aliens they passed. The galactic community was more diverse than he had imagined from the videos and briefings. Some beings were made of pure energy that flickered inside containment suits. Small creatures moved in swarms that somehow functioned as a single consciousness. One silicon-based life form looked like a walking crystal formation that chimed softly as it moved. The engineering bay took Jake's breath away when they entered. The space was enormous and easily the size of 3 football fields. Equipment that he could not begin to identify filled every available surface. Holographic displays floated in the air and showed streams of data in symbols he had never seen before. At the center of it all hung a massive cylindrical structure that glowed with soft blue light. The air hummed with energy, and Jake could feel the vibration in his bones. This is the quantum fold drive, and Vexaron explained as they approached the central structure. It operates by creating a symmetrical collapse of quantum probability fields across 17 spatial dimensions, which effectively allows us to compress the distance between 2 points in space. Jake listened, but most of the technical explanation went over his head. The words made sense individually, but strung together, they might as well have been in an alien language. "Can you show me the actual engine?" and Jake interrupted. "The physical mechanism, I mean." Vex-Aaron blinked his compound eyes in what might have been surprise. "The physical mechanism?" And he repeated as if the concept was strange to him. "You wish to see the actual hardware, rather than examine the mathematical models first." Jake nodded and pulled out his flashlight from his tool bag. "Yeah, I need to see how it is actually put together and not just the computer simulation. I have always learned better by looking at the real thing rather than diagrams." Chief Engineer Dralmek approached them, and her crystalline skin pulsed with curiosity. She manipulated a control panel, and a section of the floor slid open. The massive cylindrical engine descended on an electromagnetic field until it hung at eye level. Jake walked around it slowly, and his trained eye took in every detail. He shone his flashlight at various points and noted how the light reflected off different surfaces. The engine was covered in circuit patterns that glowed and pulsed in rhythm. Small nodules dotted its surface in precise geometric arrangements. "Tell me about this collapse thing again," and Jake said as he continued his inspection. "What happens at 3.2 parsecs exactly?" Dralmek pulled up a holographic simulation and pointed to a specific section. "The quantum field destabilizes here," and she explained. "The harmonic frequency shifts by 0.003%, which cascades through the entire system and causes catastrophic failure." The simulation showed the field as a web of glowing lines that suddenly shattered like glass. Jake nodded slowly and crouched down to examine the base of the engine assembly. "And you have tried recalibrating the frequency generators?" and he asked, while studying the components. 17,000 different configurations, and Vex-Aaron replied from behind him. "All of them resulted in failure at the same threshold. We have also attempted modifying the quantum stabilizers and adjusting the dimensional alignment protocols, and even restructuring the entire mathematical framework of the field generation. Nothing has worked." "What are these things?" and Jake asked as he pointed to a series of small nodules arranged in a perfect circular pattern around the engine's midsection. "Quantum stabilizers," and Dralmek answered. "They maintain field coherence by dampening random fluctuations in the quantum foam. Each one is precisely calibrated to work in harmony with the others." "How many are there?" and Jake asked, as he counted them with his finger. 48, and she replied. "They are arranged in perfect geometric precision, according to 17-dimensional mathematics." Jake stood up and scratched his head. The gesture was very human and very out of place in the advanced alien engineering bay. He looked at the engine, and then at the hologram, and then back at the engine again. His mind was processing what he saw and comparing it to problems he had solved back on Earth. "Anybody ever try 49?" and he asked casually. The engineering bay fell completely silent after Jake spoke those words. Vex Aaron's translator device seemed to malfunction for a moment and emitted a harsh, static sound before recovering. "I am sorry, but could you repeat that?" and the commander asked. His forearms had gone rigid, and his compound eyes fixed on Jake, with an intensity that made the human mechanic uncomfortable. 49 stabilizers, and Jake repeated while pointing at the circular arrangement on the engine. "Or maybe 47, if that works better." "You said perfect geometric precision, right? But what if that is the problem?" Dralmek's crystalline skin flickered rapidly, and Jake had learned this was a sign of intense emotion among Keltharians. "The mathematics specifically requires perfect symmetry," and she said in a voice that trembled slightly. "Adding or removing a stabilizer would create an imbalance that would violate the fundamental principles of 17-dimensional field theory. Every calculation we have ever performed confirms that symmetry is absolutely essential for quantum field stability. Without perfect balance, the field would collapse immediately upon initialization. That might absorb the frequency shift," and Jake finished her sentence in a different direction than she expected. "Look, I do not know anything about your 17 dimensions or whatever, but I know about harmonic vibration. Back in Detroit, we had this assembly line that kept shaking itself apart. The whole thing would rattle so hard that bolts would come loose and parts would fly off. Engineers kept trying to make everything more rigid and more perfectly balanced. They added reinforcements and tightened every connection and made sure every component was exactly symmetrical." Jake walked back to the engine and ran his hand along its smooth surface, but it kept shaking and getting worse, actually. Then, this old guy named Pete, who had worked in the factory for 40 years, suggested something crazy. He said we should add an asymmetric dampener that would absorb the excess vibration instead of fighting it. The engineers thought he was insane because it went against everything they learned in school. But we tried it anyway, and the shaking stopped completely. Turned out, the perfect symmetry was actually amplifying the harmonics instead of canceling them out. Vex Aaron and Dralmek exchanged glances, and their alien features were unreadable to Jake, but he sensed he had said something important. "You understand," and Vex Aaron said slowly and carefully as if speaking to a child. "We have spent 3,000 years perfecting the symmetrical arrangement of these components. Our most advanced computational systems have analyzed every possible configuration within the parameters of established quantum field theory. Millions of scientist hours have gone into validating the mathematical models that prove symmetry is required." "Yeah, but did they analyze the impossible ones?" and Jake asked. "Sometimes the answer is not in the math, and it is in the metal. My dad used to say that equations do not have grease under their fingernails. He meant that real machines behave differently than perfect theoretical models. There is always friction and heat, and tiny imperfections that the math does not account for. Maybe your 17-dimensional whatever is the same way." Dralmek moved to her console with sudden urgency, and her crystalline body practically vibrated with excitement or anxiety, or both. "I am running a simulation now with 49 stabilizers in an asymmetric arrangement," and she announced. Her fingers moved across holographic controls with practiced speed, and the display filled with cascading numbers. Jake could not understand any of it, but he recognized the body language of someone testing a theory they both hoped and feared might work. The simulation would take several minutes to complete, so they waited in tense silence. Vex Aaron stood beside Jake and seemed to be wrestling with conflicting thoughts. "In all my years of engineering," and he said quietly, "I have never questioned the fundamental assumption of symmetry. It is built into every aspect of our technology and our understanding of physics. The idea that asymmetry could be the solution seems to violate everything we know. Yet your simple example about the assembly line makes a kind of intuitive sense that our equations have missed." Jake shrugged because he did not know what else to do. "Back home I am just a mechanic," and he said honestly. "I fix cars and trucks, and sometimes industrial equipment. I am not a scientist or an engineer with fancy degrees. But I have learned that machines talk to you if you listen. They tell you what is wrong through the sounds they make, and the way they vibrate, and the heat they generate. Sometimes you have to ignore what the manual says and trust what the machine is telling you." The holographic display suddenly froze, and Dralmek went completely still. Commander and she whispered in a voice so quiet that the translator barely picked it up. The harmonic collapsed and she paused as if afraid to continue. It does not occur. Vex-Aron rushed to the display so fast that Jake almost could not track his movement. What? And the commander demanded. Show me the data immediately. Dralmek manipulated the controls with shaking hands and brought up a detailed analysis. The asymmetric stabilizer creates a quantum buffer that absorbs the frequency shift, and she explained, while pointing to specific sections of the simulation. The field remains stable. Past 3.2 parsecs. Past 10 parsecs. Past, and she trailed off as she extended the simulation further and further. Commander, according to this model, the field remains stable indefinitely. There is no collapse threshold at all. The implications of what she was saying slowly sank into the room. Vex-Aron stared at the display, and then at Jake, and then back at the display again. His mandibles clicked rapidly in what Jake now recognized as extreme agitation. This is not possible, and he said, but his tone had changed from dismissive to awed. How did we miss this? How did thousands of our greatest minds over thousands of years miss something so simple? We have computational systems that can model the behavior of entire galaxies, and yet, we did not think to test an asymmetric arrangement. You were looking for perfect solutions, and Jake said. Sometimes things need to be a little bit wrong to work right. It is like when you balance a wheel on a car. You would think a perfectly balanced wheel would spin perfectly, but sometimes it still wobbles. So you add a tiny weight in just the right spot, which makes it technically unbalanced, and suddenly it spins smooth. The imperfection creates stability. Dralmek was already pulling up manufacturing specifications, and her earlier hesitation had been replaced by focused determination. I will begin fabrication of the additional stabilizer immediately, and she announced. With the station's manufacturing capacity, we can have it ready for installation in 4 hours. We will need to recalculate the positions of all existing stabilizers to create the precise asymmetric pattern that the simulation indicates will work. I can do it in 2, and Jake said, while pulling his worn tool bag from his shoulder. Just point me to your machine shop and give me the specifications. I have worked with materials I did not understand before, and I can figure it out. Plus, I want to make sure it is done right, because if this does not work, I will feel really stupid for suggesting it. Vex-Aron placed one of his clawed hands on Jake's shoulder in a gesture that transcended species. Mr. Hoffman, and he said with genuine warmth in his translated voice, whether this works or not, you have already given us something valuable. You have reminded us that sometimes the greatest obstacle to solving a problem is the certainty that we already know all the possible solutions. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of focused activity that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. He had indeed fabricated the 49th quantum stabilizer in just under 2 hours, and he worked with tools and materials he had never seen before. The Keltharian machine shop was incredible, and it could manipulate matter at the atomic level. Jake approached it the same way he approached any unfamiliar equipment back in Detroit, and he pressed buttons and watched what happened and adjusted his technique until he got the results he needed. The Keltharian engineers watched in fascination as he worked because his methods seemed crude and intuitive compared to their precise mathematical approaches, but they were undeniably effective. Installing the additional stabilizer required carefully recalculating the positions of all the others to create the precise asymmetry that Jake's intuition suggested would work. This was where Dralmek's expertise proved invaluable, because she understood the mathematics in ways that Jake never could. She adapted the theoretical models to accommodate the deliberately imperfect arrangement, and this went against every principle of Keltharian engineering. The equations fought her at every step, because they were designed to optimize for symmetry. She had to essentially create new mathematical frameworks that allowed for controlled asymmetry. And it was like teaching the computer to accept that 2 plus 2 might sometimes equal 5. The other engineers on the station had gathered to watch the installation process. Word had spread quickly through the facility that a human mechanic had proposed a solution that contradicted 3,000 years of established theory. Some were skeptical and believed this was a waste of time and resources. Others were cautiously hopeful because they had spent their entire careers failing to solve this problem, and any new approach was worth trying. A few were openly excited because the simulation results were impossible to ignore, even if they seemed to violate fundamental principles. Jake tightened the last connection on the stabilizer array and stepped back to examine his work. The 49 quantum stabilizers now formed a pattern that looked almost perfect, but had subtle variations that created intentional imbalance. To his eye, it looked wrong in the same way that an asymmetric dampener on an assembly line looked wrong. But his hands told him it was right, and he had learned long ago to trust his hands over his eyes. The blue glow from the stabilizers pulsed in a rhythm that was not quite synchronized, and that deliberate lack of perfect harmony was the key to everything. Now they stood in the observation deck as the modified engine powered up for its first real test. The prototype Starship was little more than a skeletal frame, with the quantum fold drive at its core. It hung in space outside the station, and connected by data cables and safety tethers that could pull it back if something went wrong. Jake pressed his face against the viewport window and felt his heart pounding. If this worked, he would have accomplished something incredible. If it failed, he would be the human who wasted valuable resources on a stupid idea. All systems nominal and a technician reported from the control station. Quantum field generators online and responding to commands. Stabilizers are showing expected parameters within acceptable variance ranges. The energy collectors are feeding power to the drive core at optimal levels. Jake noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, and he shoved them in his pockets so no one would see. Vex Aaron stood beside him with his forearms crossed in a posture that Jake had learned indicated nervous anticipation. "If this works, human," and Vex Aaron said quietly, "you will have accomplished something that has eluded our civilization, since before your species learned to make fire. We were building starships and exploring the galaxy when your ancestors were still living in caves. Yet you may have solved in minutes what we could not solve in millennia." Jake swallowed hard and tried to think of something appropriate to say. "And if it does not work," and he asked instead, "then we have a very expensive debris field and many difficult questions to answer to the High Council," and Vexeron replied with what might have been humor. "No pressure then," and Jake muttered. Dralmek's voice came over the communication system and filled the observation deck. "Beginning quantum field initialization," and she announced in a tone that was professionally calm, but Jake could hear the tension underneath. "Field strength at 20%, and building steadily. All harmonics within expected ranges. 40% now, and the stabilizers are responding as predicted by the new models. 60%, and we are approaching the threshold where conventional theory predicted immediate collapse." The view outside the window shimmered as space itself began to bend around the test ship. Jake had seen videos of the effect before, but witnessing it in person was completely different. Reality seemed to fold in on itself and created a pocket of compressed space-time around the vessel. Colors that did not exist in normal human perception flickered at the edges of the quantum field. The ship appeared to be in multiple places at once, as if it existed in several dimensions simultaneously. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely alien. Field strength at 90%, and Dralmek continued, approaching critical threshold for drive activation. Distance from origin 0.1 parsec, and the field is stable. 2 parsecs, and maintaining coherence. 3 parsecs, and we are now entering unknown territory. Everyone in the observation deck held their breath, and the only sound was the hum of equipment and the rapid clicking of Vexeron's mandibles. This was the point where every previous test had failed for 3,000 years. This was where the equations predicted catastrophic collapse, and where reality had always agreed with the mathematics. 3.2 parsecs, and Dralmek announced, and her voice was tight with tension. "Harmonic frequency shift detected as expected. The asymmetric stabilizer is engaging and creating the predicted quantum buffer. The buffer is absorbing the variance, and the field is," and she paused for a moment that felt like an eternity. "The field is holding. It is working. Commander, the field remains stable." A collective exhale seemed to fill the observation deck, and Jake realized he had been holding his breath without knowing it. Several technicians made gestures that Jake assumed were expressions of relief or amazement in their respective cultures. One small alien that looked like a floating jellyfish changed colors from dark blue to bright yellow. Another being that resembled a collection of metal rods began humming in what might have been their version of celebration. 4 parsecs and Dralmek's voice was rising with excitement that she could no longer contain. 5 parsecs and still stable. 6 parsecs and all readings are nominal. Commander, this is remarkable and unprecedented. We have never maintained field stability for more than a fraction of a second at these distances. The harmonic buffer is performing exactly as the human suggested. The asymmetry is creating stability through controlled imbalance. Take it to 10 parsecs, and Vexaron ordered, and his voice was steady, but Jake could see that all 4 of his hands were trembling. 10 parsecs confirmed, and Dralmek replied, field integrity at 99.7%. Energy consumption is actually 30% lower than our original projections. The quantum foam is stabilizing in ways that our models never predicted. Commander, I am reading secondary harmonics that are reinforcing the primary field. The imperfection is not just preventing collapse, but it is actually making the entire system more efficient. Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen, and he realized it was relief mixed with pride and disbelief. It worked. And he whispered to himself, it actually worked. Vexaron turned to face him, and for the first time the alien's stern demeanor cracked into what might have been a smile. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in a grand hall on the Keltharian homeworld, and felt distinctly uncomfortable in the formal attire the embassy had provided. The clothing was designed to fit human proportions, but it still felt strange against his skin. The chamber around him was enormous, and filled with dignitaries from across the galactic community. Jake saw species he had never encountered before, and some that he could barely comprehend as living beings. All of them had gathered to witness the High Council's formal recognition of his achievement. The weight of their attention made him want to disappear back to his little garage in Detroit, where the only eyes watching him belonged to cars. The quantum fold drive had passed every subsequent test, with results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Not only did it work, but the asymmetric stabilizer configuration proved to be 30% more efficient than the original design had promised. Ships equipped with the new drive could cross the galaxy in days rather than weeks. The Keltharian military was already planning expeditions to regions of space that had been unreachable before. Trade routes that took months could now be completed in a fraction of the time. The economic and strategic implications were staggering. This is all a bit much, and Jake whispered to Ambassador Lisa Crawford, who stood beside him in her own formal diplomatic attire. Get used to it, and Crawford replied with a slight smile. You have just changed the course of galactic history, and that is not an exaggeration. The Keltharians are already retrofitting their entire fleet with the new drive system. 5 other civilizations have requested the specifications and are willing to pay enormous sums for the technology. You are famous, Jake, and not just on Earth, but across multiple star systems. I just added one more widget to the engine, and Jake protested quietly. You solved a 5,000-year-old problem in 10 minutes, and Crawford corrected him. That is a little more significant than adding a widget, and you need to understand the impact this has had. The Keltharians have built their entire civilization on the belief that they are the most advanced engineers in the galaxy. You have forced them to question assumptions they held for millennia. That kind of paradigm shift does not happen often. High Chancellor Morthek approached the podium at the front of the hall. The ancient alien's crystalline structure had taken on a deep amber hue, and Crawford had explained this was a sign of great wisdom and respect among his people. The hall fell silent as he raised his primary manipulation appendages. We gather today, and his voice resonated through the chamber, and the translators rendered it in dozens of languages simultaneously, to acknowledge a truth that many of us had forgotten. That knowledge takes many forms, and wisdom can come from unexpected sources. The High Chancellor's words carried weight that went beyond their simple meaning. For 5,000 years, we pursued perfection. And Morthek continued. We believed that the answer to our greatest challenge lay in ever more complex mathematics and ever more precise engineering. We built computational systems that could model the behavior of entire star systems. We developed mathematical frameworks that described 17 dimensions of reality. Yet in all our sophistication, we became blind to simpler truths. He gestured toward Jake with one crystalline appendage. Yet it was Jake Hoffman, and he announced, a human with no formal higher education who saw what thousands of our greatest minds could not. He reminded us that sometimes the most elegant solution is not the most symmetrical one. That imperfection carefully applied can achieve what perfection cannot. That intuition born from practical experience can solve problems that pure theory cannot touch. The hall erupted in sounds that Jake's translator rendered as applause, though the actual noises varied wildly between species. Some stomped their feet or limbs in rhythmic patterns. Others clicked mandibles or changed colors rapidly. One being seemed to vibrate at frequencies that Jake felt in his chest rather than heard. The cacophony lasted for several minutes, and Jake felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. He had never been comfortable being the center of attention. Mr. Hoffman and Morthek continued when the noise subsided. On behalf of the Keltharian Empire and the galactic community, we offer you the Star of Innovation. This is our highest honor for technological advancement, and it has only been awarded 17 times in the history of our civilization. You are the first human to receive it, and the first non-Keltharian in over 2,000 years. Additionally, we would like to extend an invitation for you to remain with us as Chief Human Consultant for the Imperial Engineering Corps. Jake stepped forward to accept a floating crystalline sculpture that represented the award. The object hovered in the air before him and glowed with an inner light that shifted through colors. He reached out carefully, and his fingers closed around it. The crystal felt warm and seemed to pulse with energy. He looked out at the assembled aliens, and then back at Ambassador Crawford, who nodded encouragingly. His throat felt tight, and he struggled to find words appropriate for the moment. Thank you, and Jake said finally. I am honored, really, and I mean that. But I have got to be honest, because I am not sure I understood half of what I did. I just know what I know about machines and how they work. They are temperamental sometimes, just like people. They do not always follow the rules the way you expect them to. You have got to listen to them and feel how they work, and sometimes trust your gut when the math does not make sense. He paused and tried to organize his thoughts. I think maybe that is something humans can offer, and he continued. We are pretty new to all this space travel stuff, and we do not know as much as everyone else here. We are still figuring out basic things that you all mastered thousands of years ago. But maybe that means we see things differently. We are not locked into thinking that has been the same way for millennia. We still make mistakes and try crazy ideas, and sometimes stumble onto solutions by accident. Vexaron, who stood to the side, clicked his mandibles in approval. Wisdom indeed, Mr. Hoffman, and he said, perhaps that is humanity's greatest gift to the galactic community. Not just your ingenuity, but your willingness to question established truths. Your species has only been traveling the stars for 20 years. Yet you have already contributed more than some races have in 10,000 years. It makes one wonder what else you might accomplish. After the ceremony, Jake mingled with various dignitaries who wanted to meet the human who had revolutionized Starship technology. He shook hands and appendages and energy fields, and tried to be polite, even though he wanted nothing more than to return to his quarters and sleep. Dralmek approached with several other Keltharian engineers, and her crystalline skin glowed with barely contained enthusiasm. Mr. Hoffman, and she said, we have 17 other engineering problems that have puzzled us for centuries, and some of them are even more complex than the quantum fold drive. We were wondering if you might be willing to examine them and offer your perspective. We have tried everything conventional, and we are hoping your unconventional approach might yield similar breakthroughs. Jake laughed because he could not help himself. Let me guess, and he said, you have tried everything, and thrown your best scientists at these problems, and spent decades or centuries working on them. Precisely, and Dralmek confirmed. Well then, and Jake replied, show me the engines, and let us see what we can figure out. But I am going to need some coffee first, or whatever you have that passes for coffee around here. As Jake followed the engineers out of the grand hall, Ambassador Crawford watched him go with a mixture of pride and amusement. She activated her communication device to send a report back to Earth. Crawford to Earth Command, and she said quietly, you are not going to believe this, but we are going to need to send more mechanics. A lot more mechanics. Behind her, the assembled dignitaries continued to discuss the implications of what had occurred. The humans had been part of the galactic community for less than a year, and already one of them had accomplished what no other species had managed in millennia. The question on everyone's mind was simple and profound. What else might humanity achieve if one untrained mechanic could solve a 5,000-year-old problem in minutes? What other assumptions were the older races holding on to that humans might overturn with their fresh perspectives? Far across the galaxy on a small blue planet, a teenager named Chris Peterson sat in his garage taking apart an old motorcycle engine. Grease covered his hands, and rock music played from a cheap speaker. He did not know it yet, but in 3 years he would join the Galactic Exchange Program, and he would solve a problem with faster-than-light communication that had stumped alien scientists for 8,000 years. All by noticing that sometimes signals worked better when you did not try to eliminate all the noise. But that was a story for another time.